Howdy, folks. Welcome to the November edition of Cattle Trails Showcase. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. Mighty glad to be your host. Today, we're going to hear about the Western Cattle Trail and get some great background information for the future. The purpose of the Cattle Trails Showcase is to continually highlight the museums, the communities, the attractions, and historical elements along the Chisholm and the Western Cattle Trails. Showcase is brought to you by the International Chisholm Trail Association, of which Dennis Katzenmeyer is president. Michael Grauer is vice president, Nancy Lawrence is secretary, and Mary Lou Rivers is treasurer. And Lonnie Steben is our showcase chair. Before I go any further, I do want to give a shout out to the many volunteers that helped make the Chisholm Trail Conference a success here in Ellsworth just a couple of weeks ago. We had excellent speakers. We had a really good time in Ellsworth. So tip of the hat to Dennis Katzenmeyer, to Nancy Lawrence, to Mary Lou Rivers, and all the volunteers there in Ellsworth that did such a nice job with the conference. Of course, today's program is in our series of the Cattle Trails Showcase. And note that it is Cattle Trails Showcase, not Chisholm Trail Showcase. It's intended to be broad to include the other great cattle trails, and certainly the Western is one of those. And so we've had a few examples of attractions on the Western Trail on this program in the past, but today we want to get a big picture, a little bit more background about the Western Cattle Trail more broadly. And for people who, like me, who may not know all that much about the Western Cattle Trail, this should be a treat. We do have our own Michael Grauer as our presenter. Michael, as you heard, is vice president of the International Chisholm Trail Association, but he's president of the Western Cattle Trail Association. And so we're delighted to have Michael present. In terms of a bio, Michael is a Kansas native. He holds degrees in painting and art history from the University of Kansas, a Master of Arts in Art History from Southern Methodist University, and the Master of Arts in History from West Texas A&M. He worked at the Smithsonian American Art Museum before becoming curator of Western Art and Art and Western Heritage at the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum of Canyon, Texas for 30 years. In 2018, he became the McCaslin Chair of Cowboy Culture and curator of Cowboy Collections and Western Art at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. Michael, we're excited to hear from you about the Western Cattle Trail.
Thank you. I appreciate you all letting me a stand-in to the real experts on the Western Trail, and they are Margaret and Gary Kreisinger. I'm going to hold up a copy of their book so y'all can see it. This is the second book they've published on the Western Trail, and as you can see by the medallions on it, not only did we give it a Wrangler Award for Best Book in 2016, but it also won the Wild West History Association's 2016 Best Book. The Kreisingers have forgotten more about the Western Trail than I'll ever know. And everything I learned at their knee. And I'm just a very pale stand-in for them, and I need to say that right off the bat. The presentation I'm going to give this morning was prepared in conjunction with an exhibition that I co-curated at for the Kansas City Public Library called Cattle, Cowboys, and Culture. And it really was about the establishment of Amarillo, Texas as a cow town, to the point where by 1900, it was the largest cattle shipping point in the world. All of that came about because of the Western Trail. And I'm going to touch on those things as we go through. So you'll see quite a heavy influence on the Texas Panhandle. And I don't mean to skew that way. It's just where this presentation goes, because everything springs from there. Suffice it to say that the Western Cattle Trail took more cattle north by far than the other cattle trails combined, and it lasted longer from 1874 to 1897. And that's the important thing to remember. It also extended across 9 states and also touched into Canada as well as into northern Mexico. So that's the key to what we do with the Western Cattle Trail Association, which was in fact an offshoot of a previous organization that we founded with some folks in Dodge City in 2016. And like I got elected vice president of the Chisholm Trail Association because I wasn't in the room, the same sort of thing happened with the Western. And we've tried to fight the good fight. We do not have nearly the reach that Chisholm Trail Association has. but we're trying. We're trying to establish chapters in all the 9 states. However, and it's important that I state this, there is another group that pushes back against trying to do because of an unfortunate adjective that got added, and that's the way I say it, added to the name erroneously and with no historical basis. I don't want to get into that today. I'm just going to tell you, if you add the unfortunate adjective to the name of the Western Trail, you're stating it incorrectly. North of Nebraska, it's typically called the Texas Trail. As you go further north, and sometimes the Miles City Trail. But it's all part of the Western Trail system, and that's what the Kreisingers push in their book, and especially with their hand-drawn maps. I believe they have visited every county that the Western has crossed. And you want to talk about research? I've never seen research hounds like them. I have all their maps in my office. I have a couple of them hanging. And the other thing I need to state right now, the Western, the Lonesome Dove Trail, air quotes, is not the Western Trail. The Western Trail inspired it. Unfortunately, the other group has sucked that into their documentation, let's call it. So it's largely been hijacked. But we're going to try, what we're trying to do, because we're a small group but we're mighty, is to make sure people understand where it went and its context. So that's what I'm going to take you through today in about 40 minutes. I'm going to share my screen. There it is. There it is. Did it go? There we are. All right. So Western Cattle Trail. I think the important thing to remember, and some of this is rehashing, but I think we need to remember where it went and what was occurring during the territorial growth of the United States. Sometimes we forget this, the larger context. One of the things I've been doing since I got here, and I've been mentored by this by scholars like Bruce Shackelford, to make sure that the Spanish and Mexican part of this story is told. Frankly, the National Cowboy Museum was fairly weak in that. And Bruce, I'm proud to say that we just yesterday finished building the new case for the first cowboy, the Mexican vaquero, the Spanish vaquero, New Spain vaquero. That'll be going in the next months, as well as an exhibitions case on cowboys of South America, as well as a whole new exhibit case in our rodeo gallery on the origins of rodeo with the charreada. So those 3 things are happening. So I especially note the Spanish treaty line that you can see there, that up into southwestern Kansas follows the Arkansas River. And I think that's critical to understand. When you cross the Arkansas River after 1819, you were in Spain for a couple of years, and then you were in Mexico. And so the Western traverses multiple countries during its lifetime, although countries that had gone away. And also call your attention to the Louisiana Purchase. One of the things that most people don't realize is, yes, of course, we bought it from the French. Problem is that Spain still claimed it. So Napoleon got a good deal out of that, but ultimately it was still considered Spanish territory, at least by the Spanish. I'm shorthanding a lot of things here today, but I think the most important ingredient that involves the Western Trail is of course the inland empire that was Comancheria, certainly by 1800. And I'd call your attention to Pekka Hemalainen's amazing book called Comanche Empire. Empire of the Summer Moon is a really nice book. But if you really want to know about Comanche history, then you need to read Hemalainen, because it's phenomenal. And he basically says they dominated everything in the center part of the United States, from the Front Range of the Rockies to the Mississippi Valley, through trade and intimidation, all the way down into, as you can see, northern Mexico, and way up into the Dakotas and into Wyoming and Montana. And the Western cuts right through the heart of that. That's important to remember. And likewise, the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 ostensibly placed them in a southwestern corner of what's today known as Oklahoma. You can see that in the right-hand image of Comanche, Kiowa, and the Apache Reservation. And of course, partnering them with their mortal enemies, the Apaches, was brilliant as part of the U.S. government. You know the Joseph McCoy story. We know he's the enterprising cattleman, comes out of Illinois to establish Abilene as a cow town. Here's a map from the Handbook of Texas, or Texas Historical Commission, rather. If you'll notice the trail that's in red here, you can see some of the tendrils of the Western Trail. Doesn't extend quite down into northern Mexico, but it really should. You can see San Antonio is part of the system, Bernie, Texas. Also, Bandera is in that region, and as you can see, it cuts through Coleman, going north through Fort Griffin into Doan's Crossing. And then after that, I'll pick it up as we go on. But just to kind of cement it in place where we're talking about, it's everything west of I-35, because I-35 roughly follows the old Chisholm Trail system. So also notice in green what's called the Potter-Bacon Trail that cuts diagonally across the Texas Panhandle through Tascosa. That's also considered part of the Western Trail system. That's an important thing to remember, and a lot of this took place as a shorter route. It was a much drier route, so the animals suffered more greatly, but this is also a response to for the Western Trail to Kansas quarantines against Texas cattle. One more map just to place Comancheria in context, and I would also call your attention to the Goodnight Loving Trail, which conveniently skirts Comancheria. That's what I believe. I doubt it's unique to me. I think Goodnight knew better than to cut right across there in the mid-1860s, so he went around it for the most part. Didn't do Oliver Loving any good because he still got ultimately killed by Comanches, but in any case, that's an important thing to remember. The recognition of the power of Comancheria, I think, is essential to understanding those two Western trails in particular, the Western and the Goodnight Loving. I also think it's important to understand the U.S. Army's role in helping protect the cattle industry, and this is a really great map showing the frontier federal forts and the cattle trails. You can see the Chisholm system as it goes north up through Fort Graham, Fort Worth, and then to Sybils Bend, and then Red River Station going a little further west. But notice the string of forts that start at Fort Richardson, Griffin, Phantom Hill, Chadburn, Concho, and then swing west and then ultimately northwest. That created something of a buffer to hopefully ostensibly protect the cattle trail industry from depredations, what they call depredations, from Comancheria and Comanche allies, Kiowas, Southern Cheyennes, Apaches, and so on. So I think that's important to understand is the U.S. Army's role, I think more specifically towards the Western Trail than perhaps the others. And that extends ultimately into the Western Trail story. So once again, this attracted the attention, this phenomenon of that supply and demand story, to use the phrase from Jimmy Skaggs. And I love this illustration from Harper's New Monthly magazine called On the Trail. And those are the most well-behaved cattle in the history of the world, following the superhighways that were clearly marked out so they wouldn't stray either one side or the other into cultivated fields and vast prairies. And they look strangely like Guernseys or Jerseys or something. I'm not sure what kind of longhorns these are, but I don't think they came originally from Spain, perhaps the British Isles. I'm not sure. Another part of the equation is the bison hunters, who were certainly down in the region where the Western Trail cut through northwestern Texas, western Oklahoma, what's today western Oklahoma, and also southwestern Kansas. And the best known, of course, is Adobe Walls, which was established in what's now Hutchinson County, Texas, a little further west of the Western Trail proper. But the actions of those bison hunters really stirred up the Southern Plains tribes, and it ultimately resulted in what's known today as the Red River War or the Buffalo War. And as you can see by the little map there on the left, it was really an encirclement process to surround these what were known as hostiles or renegades and push them back onto the reservation in southwestern Oklahoma. It really was a roundup operation. I personally think that it was also partly having to do with the nascent Western Trail and keeping the cattle industry flowing. That's what I believe. That's part of my research these days. But I think it's also important to recognize the results of the Battle of Adobe Walls and ultimately the Red River War campaign, which actually involved what's called the Lone Tree Massacre in southwestern Kansas, as well as the German Family Massacre up near Fort Wallace, and so on. So those things took place. And so ultimately the U.S. Army and the federal government had to take greater action than they had before. So again, one more map. I know it's a lot of maps, but I think it's important to cement this in your minds. Of course, we changed colors, as you can see. Notice that the Western Trail is now in yellow, Potter Bacon in blue. Again, they're part of the Western system, but you'll also see what's called Fletcher's Route that joins with the Western around Dodge City. Now, remember, all these maps, everybody takes a little shorthand, so I would rely on the Chreisinger's maps because they're far more accurate. And this is actually a part that I had direct experience with this summer when I visited the coffee ranches up in northwestern Nebraska, and I'll say more about that when we get there in just a minute. But the branching off of these trails, I think we need to remember that none of these trails was hard and fast. I think we have this misconception, or many in the general public have a misconception that they were, super highways when they weren't. Cows go where they want to go. It's those drovers' jobs to kind of keep them headed in a general direction. But they're still animals and they still go where they want to. They're a little like third graders. So in March I show this up here again. This is Harper's March of '74. I love this image. This is hand colored Texas cattle trade guarding the herd. You'll notice that the drover is carrying a whip. Sometimes I think we need to remember that they're pushing these animals. They're not rounding them up. They may have to rope from time to time, but really the use of the whip is a key tool in understanding the droving story. And so keeping these animals quiet. And of course, if you look at all the illustrations in this Harper's, they're actually quite hysterical. So this is one of the most benign, I guess you could say, of this image. However, in March of 1874, this man, enterprising cattleman out of Texas in Medina County, partnered with a couple of men, Charles Schreiner being one of them. You can look up Schreiner's name, and took a herd of cattle, about 3,500 head, to this place, the newly established Red Cloud Agency in the northwest corner of Nebraska. Today, Camp Robinson is Fort Robinson, and you can visit this today, but it was named for Red Cloud, the great Lakota chief. And this is a wonderful depiction because the landscape drawing in the background is pretty accurate. And we need to remember that this part of Nebraska is really the southern part of the Black Hills, established as a national park. And my wife and I got a chance to visit there in July. And we actually were bivouacked, we'll put it that way, at one of the brick buildings there at Fort Robinson. And I encourage you to go see it. But the reason I was there is to present at the 150th anniversary ranch party for what was called the Hat Creek Ranch. Does that sound familiar to any of you who are victims of popular culture? That's, of course, should remind you of the Hat Creek Cattle Company, run by Augustus McCrae and Woodrow Call from Lonesome Dove fame. Gosh, I wonder where Larry McMurtry got some of his inspiration, perhaps from real live things. So I had the opportunity to do a living history presentation here at the Hat Creek Ranch in northwestern Nebraska, which actually got its start. And I'm going to go back a couple of slides to that Fletcher's Route, as it's called on this map. I'm just saying that's what it's called in this map. What I believe is that Charles H. Coffey, who had taken trails out of Texas in 1871 and 72 for other men, took his own herd, probably followed, because the family lore has him going up the Chisholm. I think he probably cut across this way and ended up taking another route, ultimately over to Cheyenne, where he established the Hat Creek in 1873, and then later moved it to northwestern Nebraska in 1879. So he's very much part of Western Trail history, but it's John T. Lytle who's usually credited as the blazer of the Western Trail. So Fort Robinson, Nebraska is key in this story. U.S. government beef contracts became a great recipient and a great attraction for for cattlemen who tried to take advantage of those government contracts. Remember, using Samuel Colt as an example, you didn't make your money selling to civilians. You made your money when you got a federal contract. And so getting a federal beef contract was a big deal. I mean, that's why Goodnight blazed the Loving Trail. It was to sell beef to the reservations there. So I think that's important to remember. Just to remember where these drovers came from. Presidio soldiers like this were reluctant herders. And of course, the whole idea of cow hunts, using the cattle hides and the tallow from the carcasses as the main products. Jerked beef was an afterthought if they could jerk it at all. Those first vaqueros, these are in California, but it's a good example of where popular culture has taken the vaquero to be these colorful riders. And remember, in California, it's all about how you look rather than what you do. But I love this quotation from Lolo Trevino at the King Ranch. One of the Queneños, a cowboy without a rope is like a man without arms. And this is something that I talk about, is the whole obsession with cowboys as gunmen. This is a great photograph. This is actually Bob Olive here on the left. I'm currently reading a book on Print Olive, who's one of the famous cattlemen who came out of Texas. That's his brother there on the left in this photograph, taken probably about 1876 or 7, we believe. But a great photograph. Because remember, at the end of the trail, the first thing you want to do is make sure you got your picture made. Because remember, in today's culture, it's not what you see, it's a picture of you seeing what you see. And of course, there were Hispanic cowboys. This is obviously the Horchados in the Wild West shows. Of course, there are African-American cowboys. This is Coley Owens, who actually appears in the Black Cowboys exhibit that we have here. And if you look closely at the photograph, you'll know his cartridge belt's on upside down, not because he didn't know how to do it, but because this is a photographer's prop. Of course, cowboys were always gun toters, and so the photographers took advantage of that to make sure that they looked properly menacing in their photographs. And of course, American Indians were part of those droving herders too. I couldn't escape throwing in a photograph of Indian cattle, probably taken on Quanah Parker's range in southwestern Oklahoma, where the Western cut through. These cattle, Quanah became quite a cattleman in his own right, but it's also a photograph taken by Frank Ray, about whom I know a little bit and may have written a book about him. But yeah, he was a frontier photographer. But this is a pretty fascinating photograph made on the Comanche Reservation in southwestern Oklahoma. So who were the drovers? Some of them were even Englishmen. If you look really closely at this, Lon Taylor pointed this photograph in a great exhibition at the Library of Congress in 1985. Notice how he holds his reins. Obviously, this is a British cowboy, more than likely. And so there were Britishers all over the place. But going to Dodge City, of course, I think the misconception is that somehow the Western ended at Dodge City. What the Kreisingers have taught me and taught the rest of us is that Dodge City was really basically a stopping off point. Some of the cattle were loaded on trains on the Santa Fe Railway there, but the bulk of them swung west of Dodge City and continued on up the trail across western Kansas up to Ogallala, where they swung west again a little bit and northwest. But getting to Dodge City, of course, you had to be dressed properly to get your photograph made. And this is my favorite quotation. None were cowboys. They just dressed this way for the picture. So these are some doctors and lawyers and such who wanted to get in on this game, as you can see. But really, if you want to look to accurate photographs of who these drovers were, a cowboy outfit on the North Plains, you turn to F.M. Steele, who was based in Dodge City. This is a photograph from the Panhandle Plains collection, one of my favorites, because if you look really closely, there's nary a gun in sight, because, cowboys don't really need a gun until they're on TV. So a little bit more about guns. I'll just go through this really quickly. If a cowboy owned a gun on the trail, it was probably surplus army, as you can see here in this 1860 model. But you'll notice that it looks strangely like some of the rounds are jammed between the frame and the cylinder, because what often happens with these was something called chain fire. And if your revolver experiences chain fire, and if you're lucky enough to be holding it away from your body, then you probably didn't get hurt. But if you have it in a hip holster, your new opportunity for a job is to be a pirate because you just blew your own leg off. So getting back to the story, this is actually the map that was used by the National Park Service when they turned in their study of the Chisholm and Western, hopefully to help those two trails be named designated National Historic Trails. Obviously, that's gone by the wayside currently, but I think it's important to point out that the National Park Service only studied the Western Trail there, as you can see in that orange-red, to Ogallala. That's where they stopped. And that, unfortunately, has become something of a bone of contention for those people in the states that also include Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and both Dakotas, who are part of the Western Trail system. A more accurate map, as you can see here, this is made by Jack Potter, a longtime cattleman, and he actually gave it to Harold Bugbee, the Western artist, as you can see in the little photo, the autograph down at the lower left. Colonel Potter lived at Clayton, New Mexico for many, many years. And these are the trails as he designated them. These are pretty hard to find, but it's really a pretty accurate depiction of the Western. And you probably can't see. Can you see my pointer? Can y'all see my pointer?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so you can see it. This is the Potter Bacon cutoff that cuts off over here. There's also a swing west through the upper Texas Panhandle that ultimately follows the Kansas-Colorado line, what was proposed as the National Beef Trail, a highway, a throughway that was put before the United States Congress to designate a way to send stocker cattle on the Western Trail up to the northern ranges to help stock those ranges and new ranches there. Unfortunately, it was defeated. This is after all of Kansas was shut off to Texas cattle on the hoof in 1885. So it's important to remember that this system spread into those states, but also there was an attempt to work with the public and to accommodate that great demand for beef on the northern plains. So just this is again related to what happens in Texas. I know it's really difficult to see, but a couple of things right here in 1876. Well, right up to the end of the Red River War, Fort Elliott is established at Mobeetie, Texas, primarily to prevent Southern Plains tribes from jumping the reservation and going back to Texas. A year later, Charles Goodnight brings the first herd into Palo Duro Canyon to help establish the J.A. Ranch in June, and on his heels comes Thomas Sherman Bugbee, who establishes the second major ranch in the Texas Panhandle Quarter Circle T. Bugbee is important to this story because he ranched, or at least grazed, his cattle west of Abilene in the late 60s, but certainly from about 72 to 76, he was grazing with a dugout headquarters near Lake, Kansas, and then eventually crossed the Canadian and came south to establish his ranch in what's now Hutchinson County, Texas, ironically, just a few miles from the Adobe Walls battle site. And as you can see, there are a bunch of other things that happen in here, but the establishment of the T Anchor Ranch by 1877, all these things kind of domino here. But really, the critical thing here is the establishment of those ranges in the Texas Panhandle and elsewhere, frankly, all the way up to Western Canada, using Goodnight just as an example, who were very much trying to capitalize on that movement to get rich on the plains, because there was great eagerness on the part of British investors and Scottish investors in particular to invest in some way in getting in on this beef bonanza, because it literally was. And from my research, I believe that the Western Trail was the conduit to accommodate these dreams of riches, because you had to get the product from Texas all the way up to Montana, Wyoming, wherever it was. And so it was critical that the Western Trail be protected. And so, and actually an officer in the United States Army, James Brisman, writes this book, How to Get Rich on the Plains. Frankly, I think the U.S. Army was complicit in the cattle trade. I'm not trying to be a controversial in any way, but that's what I believe, because there were officers who were making money personally on this whole movement. So as you can see, Charles Goodnight partners with an Irish financier named John Adair. By 1885, a large portion of the cattle ranches in the American West, from the Front Range of the Rockies to the Mississippi, but primarily from Texas all the way up to Montana, were owned by British syndicates, nearly all of them. If you think of the great Jimmy Stewart, Maureen O'Hara movie, The Rare Breed, it speaks to that specifically. And so nearly all of them were invested in this, trying to get rich on the plains. And Thomas Sherman Bugby, whom I mentioned before, eventually sells his Quarter Circle T ranch to the Hansford Land and Cattle Company from Scotland for $800,000. That's a lot of money in 1884. So he's making good. And then eventually he establishes ranches in Kansas, Texas, Indian Territory, and moves to Kansas City. Alfred Roe was one of those Scottish financiers who founds the RO Ranch. And again, I'm using these as examples. The same thing is occurring in Nebraska, in Wyoming, in Montana, and in the Dakotas. So these are just examples. At Panhandle Plains, we do have the Alfred Roe collection, which includes his bison hide coat, as you can see here. Unfortunately, he went down on a boat called the Titanic. But Panhandle Plains has those papers and artifacts that are yet to be plumbed by a researcher. They're just crying for somebody to go there and dig into this. So the ranches in the Texas Panhandle, and what I show here is the front door of the Panhandle Plains Museum if you've never been there. But notice the ranches in the Texas Panhandle. Virtually every one of these was owned by a British syndicate in some form or another. You'll notice the J.C. Coles painting to the right. That was commissioned by Cornelia Adair through Charles Goodnight as literally an advertisement to sell the J.A. Ranch in 1887. This is after the big die-up. Cornelia was trying to get out of the cattle business. She was unsuccessful, and believe it or not, one of the candidates to buy the J.A. Ranch was none other than the great American painter Albert Bierstadt. And the reason that we know this is because J.C. Coles had been a student of Albert Bierstadt's in New York City. And so, and you can see in this particular painting, which was actually a wreck when I got there to Canyon in 1987, we finally had it restored not long before I left in one of two paintings. So, and of course, the Texas Panhandle became kind of a proving up ground for this new invention called barbed wire. So Ruth Gentry Bush, as you can see, grew up in Kansas City. The Glidden Bush family and Henry Sandburn found the Frying Pan Ranch. Sandburn worked for Joseph Glidden in Illinois and became his Texas salesman of barbed wire. And eventually they try out the new Glidden barbed wire on the frying pan to see how this is going to work. And it was very successful. This starts about 1881. They also fenced the T-Anchor and others. So eventually miles and miles and miles by the hundreds of thousands used this new invention. And this also plays a role with the Western Trail because these parts were fenced and therefore cut off the access to the Western Trail. By 1880, they're bringing in multiple different breeds to improve the animals. Herefords were the most successful. Shorthorns and Durhams didn't do as well in the cold Texas Panhandle, southwestern Kansas, and so on, but Herefords did quite well. So eventually, because of the Western Trail, 5 major railroads were centered in Amarillo. First line, obviously, the Fort Worth and Denver City arise in 87. And then eventually 7 railroad lines fed into Kansas City. So eventually all these operations started looking to Amarillo as a funnel. Likewise, same thing occurred with the Northern Pacific and other railroads in the north to funnel cattle to Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, and so on. I just show these statistics from Jimmy Skaggs, absolutely vital source if you're interested. Cattle trailing industry between supply and demand. Look at the jump in cattle from 1887 to 1888 when the railroad hits Amarillo. It's phenomenal. I mean, that's a half a million head, and then it keeps on rising. I mean, it's just astonishing how many cows went through Amarillo. Remember, Lubbock is the next closest city to Amarillo. It's about 100 miles south. They don't get rail service to 1909. So Amarillo really holds sway for such a long time. And eventually Kansas City becomes the largest cattle receiving point, and really corners the Western cattle industry for a while around 1900. So when cattle were loaded on the trains, and this is actually an Irwin Smith photograph, as you can see, notice the man that's holding the roll of clothes, and he has a clean shirt right there, kind of center left, standing on the tracks. A cowboy or two was asked to go with the herds that were loaded on the cattle cars to whatever the receiving place was, whether that's Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, St. Paul, wherever it was. It was their job, and it was a sign of distinction to be able to give this assignment. They either slept in the cabooses or in what were called the bunk cars, and it was their job to make sure those cattle, that product, got to where it was supposed to go in relatively good shape. And they usually met the cattleman, the rancher, in that spot, who got there by train. They certainly didn't go up the trail. That's for damn sure. They didn't do that sort of thing. So, and again, I'm focusing on Amarillo, but Amarillo as a substitute for these other cow towns that you see all along the Western Trail. So the Great American Desert, of course, railroads started offering discounts to settlers ship their belongings because the Homestead Act was being pushed by the federal government. They were already pushing the ranchers out immediately. The Homestead Act is 1862. Farmers are acceptable, ranchers are not. Farmers are manageable, ranchers are not. Those wild men on the back of the horses, you can't control them, you can't tell them what to do. But farmers, you can, they follow orders, and they're also easily taxed. That's important to remember. So Amarillo's population jumps, as you can see, in 20 years. Except cowboys continued to go there. As you can see, and I mentioned T.S. Bugbee moving to Kansas City. He lives there for 15 years, still manages all his ranches. Hansford, this is that Scottish syndicate I mentioned before. They buy the Turkey Track Ranch and eventually Quarter Circle T. But he, being a British businessman, is not really welcomed by the hands. They followed him around in his buggy and his umbrella, his parasol. And eventually, he had to hire Cap Willingham, who was a famous gunman, as his ranch supervisor and bodyguard. Bull Nelson from Burlingame, Kansas, who worked for a Hereford breeder operation out of Burlingame, eventually sells Hereford bulls into the Texas Panhandle, but moves to Kansas City for education. Henry Sanborn, father of Amarillo, moves to Kansas City. This is all driven by the cattle trail, the Western Trail, and the establishment of the cattle industry in Amarillo. So this is the animal. This is a great Frank Pray painting called The Approaching Herd. He painted in 1902. Mr. Ray painted out in Palo Pinto County in what he called Western Texas as early as 1883. So he was seeing cattle on the Western Trail as early as 1883, a little less than 10 years before, a little less than 10 years after it had been blazed by John T. Lytle. But I think the key thing to remember in all our discussions, whether it's the Western, the Chisholm, the Goodnight Loving, the Shawnee, is it was a business. And it was, and I believe, and I know smarter people than me may agree with this, the cattlemen knew their window was small. They knew what the federal government was pushing. They knew that the federal government wanted farmers. That's why they pushed the Homestead Act for multiple reasons. Meanwhile, interestingly, and this is based on some of the things I've learned in prepping for my talk in Nebraska, is that the cattlemen knew the land better than the paperclip counters in Washington, D.C., who insisted that all parts of the West looked like Kentucky and had that much water. And so they kept pushing these poor farmers out into places where the ranchers were saying, don't come out here. If you do, you're going to fail. We're not trying to make you fail. Unfortunately, what popular culture did with movies like Shane and Open Range was they castigated the cattlemen as cattle barons, which is a bunch of nonsense. But all they were doing was trying to keep these people from starving to death and failing on these homesteads that were unsupportable. 160 acres, when you have less than 20 inches of rain per year, it's a fool's errand. But the cattlemen Yes, of course, they wanted to get theirs because they knew the farmers were right behind them. And farmers, of course, bring families, they bring schools, they bring towns, they bring banks, and they also bring taxes. And so cattlemen resisted this as long as they could. But I truly believe on the Western Trail in particular, because it was the main artery to the establishment of the northern cattle ranches. I truly believe that they knew their window was small. So I think that's my last slide. I hope I've given you an idea of the Western, because it meanders, it has multiple branches, but it does reach across 9 states all the way to Alberta and Saskatchewan. Fort Macleod in Alberta is often looked at as the northern terminus, if you want to say that, as the for the Western Trail. But much like, I think it was Wayne Guard that talked about the Chisholm Trail as all the roots on a tree that run into all those branches. The same thing's true of the Western. These were businessmen. They're trying to get their cattle to market or to help establish these ranches, and they're going to use the most convenient way to get their cattle there in the best shape possible. So parts of the Western Trail are still used today, but the Western has not received nearly the attention in popular culture that the Chisholm is. It's not nearly as sexy, because it goes through the least populated parts of cattle trail history. I mean, it really does. So out where I live for the longest time on the Llano Estacado, that's a tough part of the country. I have been to Tascosa, which was on the Potter Bacon cutoff. There's not much left there. That's where they built Boys Ranch. But you can visit Boot Hill Cemetery. That is worth seeing. It was one of the tough cow towns. Billy the Kid was there. Pat Garrett was there, if you wanted to get into that kind of mess. But do remember that the Western Trail system took more cattle north, about 8 million, as I mentioned before, and also lasted longer, 1874 to 1897. And I'm glad to try to answer questions, but I would refer to you to either of the 2 Kreisinger books, and especially the most recent one on the Western Cattle Trail. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Great job. Gonna give you a virtual round of applause here, Michael. Appreciate it. Appreciate it greatly. You can stop your share.
Yep.
Thanks. I would note that the legislation that called for the feasibility study and so forth was limited in its scope. I mean, when the legislators instructed the Department of Interior to do the study, they put some parameters around it. So it was preordained that the study was not going to include the states to the north, even though there's a good case that the Western Cattle Trail included states to the north. And in fact, that's referenced in the feasibility study.
Yep.
That there was cattle movement to the north. But I think that's worth noting that to a certain extent, the scope of that study was preordained. So I'll give I think people need to understand that as they look at the National Park Service's maps and the study. Let me see if there are other questions for Michael. Yeah, Tom.
In May, I drove the Western Cattle Trail from Jones Crossing all the way up to Ogallala and then to Chicago, then to Cheyenne. And I used the 2 Kreisinger books as the means of finding both the paved roads and the dirt roads that go as close to the center of the system as I could. And I wanted to have a mental video of the landscape in my mind, of where it went and what it looked like. There was a lot of, most of it was farmland now. The Museum of the Western Plains in Altus was a good place to start. But Michael, I really had no no sense of the role that Amarillo played in this, and I also appreciate the significance of moving off to the northwest corner of Nebraska and into Montana and the Dakotas. I remember you saying earlier this year that you were going to go up there and see that, and so now I need to make another trip in the northern part to do that.
Let me jump in here. One of the things I agreed to do on my own when I got elected president of our nascent Western Cattle Trail Association was I said, I have to be in the place where these things occur. I believe that spirit lives in places. I truly believe that. And so I've driven from Bandera to Belle Fourche, South Dakota, partly because I wanted to say I went to Belle Fourche because John Wayne was going to Belle Fourche and the Cowboys. I had to say that. But I've driven that trail from Bandera all the way up, and yeah, not all at the same time because it's a good long way. But I do believe that you need to see it. I'm pleased to see my friend Frank Norris, who I shared a house with at St. Joe, Texas, a few years ago. Good to see you, Frank. Frank was the National Park Service historian who did all the extremely well done research for the study for the National Historic Trails designation. So, Frank, I'm glad you're here to join us, and I hope you won't correct me in front of these people because that's kind of embarrassing. But I do want to tell you, Tom's right. It's a unique landscape out there. And I didn't really have a sense because, I lived in West Texas where rivers don't actually have water in them. When you get to the Platte, then the Platte has water there at Ogallala, and that Platte River Valley is all in cultivation now. But if you continue on up to Fort Robinson that way, and we followed it as closely as we could, I mean, it's just spectacular. I mean, and then you go up into Black Hills one way and out into, and I would point out the Texas Trail Museum at Moorcroft, Wyoming, which is on the Western Trail. It's in the northeast corner. So there's acknowledgement all the way up. It's just, it's called different things, as I mentioned before, all the way up to Miles City and then north of that.
We're going to be reaching our time boundary here shortly. There is a question in the chat from Dwayne. Yep. Did the Western Trail go near the Cherokee Immigrant Trail? Are you familiar with the Cherokee?
Well, the Immigrant Trail crossed it in western Kansas.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, you're talking about the Cherokee Trail that they're going to the gold fields. That's the one you're talking about, I believe. Yeah, that crossed it.
Okay.
I would also, along with Hämäläinen's book on the Comanche Empire, I would strongly recommend his second book, which is called The Lakota Nation, which will cover again part of the northern part of where the Western Trail went. And then his most recent book called The Indigenous Continent is excellent, but I will from an indigenous perspective, the brand new book by Ned Blackhawk called Remaking American History is totally from an indigenous perspective. And if you want to have a very different view of 1492 to 1890 and beyond, I would strongly recommend that book. But again, I'll join with Michael to give amazing kudos to the Crazigers for both of those books. I've read them both, and I've used them both in the spring when I put together my itinerary from Dunn's Crossing all the way up to Ogallala.
I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that Fort Robinson is where Crazy Horse was imprisoned and where he was murdered. So that there's a special place, at least to me, because I think Crazy Horse is one of the greatest Americans. I believe that. Frank, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say I can learn a lot more from you than you from me, and I appreciate your remarks. What you say about the Western Trail is true, although keep in mind that there's a matter of degree difference as you go farther north.
Yep.
You get up to Ogallala, and the vast majority of people that drove cattle up the trail offloaded them either in Dodge or in Ogallala. We have, like, at least I know of only 2 or 3 people who drove their cattle from Texas on beyond to Wyoming or Montana in 1 year. Typically, they overwintered them somewhere in Nebraska,
Thank you.
maybe eastern Wyoming, before driving them farther north. So yes, it's a continuous line, but you got to think through it.
Right. Thank you. Excellent point.
Thanks, everybody. Very fascinating, and we hope that this will set the stage for future cattle trail showcases, where we'll be able to learn more about some of the attractions along the Western Trail. So we look forward to that. And Lonnie's working on plans for a Christmas theme in December, so make sure you have that on your schedule. And that would be, again, our second Friday. So it'd be Friday, December 8th, 2023 for our final cattle trail showcase of the year. To close our program today, this is Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate, saying thanks for taking time to join us in this place, and come on back next month for our cattle trail showcase. Happy trails, everyone.